The study smelled of cedar, old paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh ink. Arthur sat rigid in the high-backed chair, his head slumped backwards against the high-backed chair, his hands hanging on the chair's armrests, eyes shut, lifeless. His right hand remained locked in a death grip around a fountain pen. A thick, dark puddle of ink had bled across the surface of the desk, soaking through the edges of the final will that lay beneath his lifeless fingers. The room was perfectly still, save for the slow, steady drip of ink falling from the desk edge to the hardwood floor. It hit the wood with a rhythmic,
hollow sound. Arthur did not move. He would never move again.
The heavy silence of the house pressed against the windows, isolating the room from the rest of the estate. Light filtered through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the scattered documents. Everything in the room appeared frozen in time, yet the spreading stain on the desk suggested a struggle that had ended only moments ago. The air hung heavy, thick with the weight of an unfinished legacy and the cold, unyielding reality of a sudden end. The heavy oak door groaned on its hinges. Julian entered first, followed closely by Marcus and Silas. They stopped in unison, forming a tight semicircle around the desk.
Not one of them reached out to touch the body. Not one of them checked for a pulse.
Their eyes swept over the dead man, dismissing him as a mere obstacle that had finally been removed. Julian stepped toward the mahogany desk, his gaze sliding past the leaking pen and the ruined will. It locked onto the wall-mounted safe hidden behind the heavy velvet curtain. Marcus followed his brother's line of sight, his jaw tightening as he measured the distance to the iron door.
Silas lingered near the threshold, his fingers drumming against his own palms,
his eyes darting between his brother's and the steel lock. The air in the room grew colder, stripped of any pretense of mourning. Ambition surged through the space, thick and suffocating. They stood in the presence of death, but spoke only the silent language of inheritance. The hunt for the combination had begun before the body had even turned cold.
Julian broke the silence first, his voice sharp enough to cut the air. He turned on Marcus, his finger jabbing toward the tea service on the side table. You were the last one to bring him his drink.
Marcus, do not think I did not see you lingering in the kitchen.
Marcus did not flinch. He took a step forward, closing the space between them. My hands are clean.
Unlike yours, Julian. You have been desperate for those shares for months.
The accusations bounced off the walls, devoid of grief. Silas tried to back away, but Marcus pivoted,
his eyes dropping to the floor. Look at his boots, Marcus hissed, pointing at the heavy, dark stains on Silas's feet. Fresh garden mud. You were outside, near the service entrance.
At the exact time the house went quiet. Silas stumbled, his face flushing as he tried to hide his feet behind a chair. The room fractured. It was no longer a room of mourning, it was a cage of predators. Every movement was tactical, every word a weapon. They circled each other, eyes wide and predatory, waiting for the first sign of weakness to strike. The shouting stopped the moment the door clicked open. Elena walked into the study, her pace slow, deliberate, and entirely unbothered by the scene of death. Miller trailed one step behind her, holding a leather-bound briefcase tight against his side. The brothers fell silent, their previous bravado dissolving into a wary, collective tension. Elena did not look at the body. She walked to the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over Julian, Marcus, and Silas as if they were unruly children caught in a minor transgression. She stopped before the desk, placing a single hand on the surface. "The fighting ends here," she said, her voice low and steady. She gestured toward the document on the desk. "Until the police arrive and a formal assessment is completed, this will is legally invalid." The room seemed to shrink. Julian opened his mouth to protest, but one look from Elena froze the words in his throat. She turned to Miller, who stepped forward to block the path to the safe. The power in the room had shifted. anchored entirely on the woman who now stood between the heirs and their prize. The brothers retreated, their eyes darting, realizing their control had evaporated in an instant.
Clara remained in the corner, her presence almost invisible against the dark wood of the paneling.
While the brothers kept their eyes locked on the safe and Elena stood guard, Clara moved. She glided toward the edge of the desk, her breath shallow to avoid drawing notice. Her gaze fell on the document, then shifted to the fountain pen gripped in Arthur's stiffened hand. She squinted. The ink on the will was a deep charcoal black, thick and slightly raised from the parchment. The ink on the blotter, however, was a lighter, watery blue. She leaned in closer until the scent of old paper and chemicals filled her nostrils. The nib of the pen in his hand was dry, completely devoid of the black stain that marked the paper. A cold realization settled in her chest, sharp and immediate.
This was not a final act of a dying man. This was a stage scene. She pulled back,
her heart hammering against her ribs, and cast a quick glance at the others. They were still embroiled in their own petty power struggle, blind to the inconsistency that changed everything. She gripped the edge of the table to steady her trembling hands, her eyes narrowing as she processed the impossible truth.
The brothers were shouting again, their voices rising in a jagged,
rhythmic discord that masked the sound of Clara's footsteps. She did not look at them. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the stack of heavy ledgers abandoned on a side table near the window.
Every word they threw at each other was a shield for her movement. She shifted her weight, moving laterally until she was within reach of the documents.
Marcus suddenly spun around, his hand gesturing wildly toward the safe.
And Clara went rigid. She dropped her gaze, feigning a look of grief that felt like a mask.
When he turned back to Julian, she moved. Her fingers closed around the spine of the thickest volume,
the leather cold and textured against her palm. She slid it off the table, the movement fluid and silent.
With a quick, practiced motion, she tucked the ledger into the inner pocket of her coat. The weight of it pulled at her shoulder, a physical anchor to the secret she now held.
She took one step back, then another, retreating into the deepest shadows of the room.
The brothers were still arguing, blind to the fact that their most dangerous weapon had just left the table. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the lead detective entered, his presence cutting through the shouting match. He did not speak at first, merely surveying the room with a gaze that lingered on the body. Behind him, 2 officers began marking the floor. The questioning started in the center of the room.
Julian stood stiff, insisting he had spent the hour in the library, his voice tight and rehearsed. Marcus countered immediately, claiming he had seen Julian in the hallway near the study just minutes before the alarm.
Silas shifted, rubbing his palms together, claiming he was in the stables, yet his boots were clean of the stable mud.
The detective sighed, pulling a notepad from his pocket. He asked the same questions twice, watching the brothers weave a tangle of contradictions that made no sense. Every answer was a jab at the other, a desperate attempt to point the finger away from themselves. The air in the study grew thin, heavy with the scent of stagnant ink and stale perfume. The detective snapped his notebook shut,
his expression hardening into a mask of professional irritation. The investigation was stalling before it had truly begun.
Caught in a cycle of petty bickering that served only to hide a much darker truth, the detective looked ready to leave, his patience clearly at an end. Clara stepped out from the periphery, the silence of her movement drawing every eye in the room. She held a small, handheld security device. She pressed a sequence of buttons, and a screen illuminated, displaying a time-stamped log. She walked toward the detective, her pace measured. She pointed to the entry for the library door. The log indicated the door had been bolted from the outside at the exact time Julian claimed to be reading inside. The detective leaned in, his eyes scanning the data. He looked at Julian,
whose face drained of color as the fabrication fell apart. Marcus let out a sharp, jagged laugh, his eyes darting between his brother and the detective.
The unified front they had maintained began to buckle. Silas took a step back, distancing himself from the mounting mess. The brothers stopped shouting. The air became thick with the realization that their lies were no longer holding. Clara stood still, watching the power dynamic in the room shift.
The detective turned toward Julian, his voice low and dangerous, signaling the end of the initial deception.
The brothers were finally forced to confront the reality of their own unraveling.
The shock in the room curdled into a sharp, collective malice. Julian was the first to move, his eyes locked onto Clara with newfound intensity. He took a predatory step forward,
his shadow stretching across the floor to touch her boots. Marcus and Silas followed,
forming a semicircle that boxed her against the heavy mahogany desk. They no longer cared about the detective or the unfolding investigation. Their focus was singular. Julian reached out, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder.
His voice a low, raspy command for the ledger. Clara pressed her back against the wood,
feeling the cold grain of the desk. She did not blink. The brothers crowded closer, their breathing audible in the sudden,
suffocating silence of the study. Marcus shoved a chair aside,
the screech of metal on wood echoing through the room. Silas stepped to the side, cutting off the path to the hallway.
They were no longer arguing with each other. They were hunting. Clara gripped the edge of the desk behind her,
her knuckles white. She looked from Julian to the locked door, realizing there was no route left to retreat. The room grew smaller with every aggressive movement they made toward her.
Julian grabbed her arm, his grip hard and unyielding. The brothers pushed her into the hallway,
moving with a singular, desperate intent. Every step toward the stairs echoed against the stone floor.
They ignored her protests, shoving her forward until they reached the narrow, vertical passage leading upward.
Marcus reached ahead and kicked the attic door open, the wood groaning against the rusted hinges.
They forced her inside, the space cramped and thick with the smell of stagnant dust.
Silas followed, his heavy frame blocking the only exit as he scanned the floorboards for any sign of the ledger.
They did not find it. With a sharp shove, Julian pushed her toward the center of the room.
She stumbled, her hands catching the rough edge of a support beam to steady herself. They backed out, the sudden shift in light creating a sharp silhouette against the threshold. The door slammed shut with a final, metallic click of the bolt sliding into place. Darkness rushed in to reclaim the room.
Clara stood frozen, listening to their retreating footsteps as they moved down the stairs,
leaving her alone in the hollow silence of the attic. The walls felt closer now, the air thin and cold.
Clara did not wait for rescue. She moved to the far wall, her fingers tracing the perimeter of the room until they met the cold, iron edge of a ventilation grate. It was loose. She jammed a splinter of wood into the gap, leveraging her weight against the frame until the screws gave way with a sharp, metallic ping. The metal plate fell inward, clattering softly against the floor. She pulled herself up, pressing her face against the narrow opening to look down. Below, the garden was bathed in the pale light of a late moon. Elena stood near the stone fountain, her posture rigid, her head turned toward the shadow of the hedge.
Miller stood opposite her, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The wind carried their voices upward, thin and jagged. Clara held her breath, straining to catch the words. The mention of an offshore account drifted clearly through the shaft.
It was not a conversation about the family estate. It was a tactical exchange about hidden capital. The scale of the betrayal expanded in that moment, turning the family tragedy into a calculated, systematic theft. Miller gestured toward the house, his face unreadable in the dim light. They were coordinating. They were moving assets while the rest of the family tore itself apart inside.
The names of the banks tumbled out of the darkness below, specific and damning. Clara pressed her ear closer to the metal grating,
her pulse thumping in rhythm with the distant, rhythmic ticking of a garden clock.
She gripped the edge of the shaft, her knuckles turning white.
The offshore account mentioned was not just a side project. It was the exact destination for the missing liquidity that had triggered the company's stock collapse 3 weeks ago. Every percentage point dropped on the market was a deliberate maneuver.
A calculated draining of resources into these hidden channels. The brothers were fighting over the scraps of a dying empire,
while the real value was being siphoned out from under them in real time.
The murder of the patriarch was not the end of the conflict. It was the final.
Brutal efficiency measure to prevent him from signing the new will that would have frozen these transactions. Her mind raced.
Mapping the dates of the stock crashes against the dates of the offshore transfers. They matched perfectly. This was not just a family feud over inheritance.
It was a systematic liquidation of the entire firm. The weight of the discovery left her breathless.
The air in the attic suddenly feeling heavy with the implication of the scale of the fraud. Clara backed away from the vent, her mind sharp and cold. The attic door stood between her and the evidence she needed to present. She reached up, pulling a thin metal hairpin from her hair, and knelt before the heavy keyhole. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline. She inserted the metal tip, feeling for the pins. Click. She rotated the pick, searching for the tension point.
In the hallway outside, the heavy thud of a boot echoed against the floorboards. She froze, eyes locked on the door frame.
Someone was patrolling. She exhaled slowly and turned the pick again. The mechanism resisted, a stubborn grind of iron against iron. She adjusted her angle, sweat beading on her forehead.
Another footstep, closer this time, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. The pressure on the pick increased.
She felt the internal tumbler shift, a tiny, vibrating resistance that signaled she was close. She applied firm pressure, twisting the hairpin with focused precision. A sharp, distinct snap echoed in the confined space of the attic. The lock disengaged with a final, satisfying click. She waited a beat, listening for the guard, then reached for the handle to begin her descent.
The door swung inward with a faint, protesting creak. Clara pushed it just wide enough to slip through, her body pressing against the rough wood of the frame. She stepped into the hallway. The air here was cooler,
smelling of floor wax and dust. She stood still for a heartbeat, orienting herself in the gloom.
The silence was absolute until the distinct sound of a heavy boot striking the floorboards echoed from around the corner. She did not hesitate. She dropped into a crouch, sliding along the wall until her shoulder hit the cold plaster. The footfalls grew louder, rhythmic and heavy. She held her breath, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. A shadow stretched across the floor, elongated and sharp, creeping toward her hiding spot. She squeezed her eyes shut, hands pressed flat against the wall, waiting for the guard to pass. He moved closer, the metallic clink of a flashlight hitting a belt loop audible in the stillness. He stopped just feet away, the light beam sweeping across the opposite wall. Clara remained motionless, a ghost in the dark, as the guard paused, sighed, and then continued his patrol down the corridor. She opened her eyes, the danger still pulsing in her chest. Clara pushed away from the wall, her movements fluid and silent. The hallway stretched ahead like a dark vein,
the floorboards groaning under the weight of the house. She reached the intersection and paused,
pressing her back against the decorative molding. Ahead, the glow of a flashlight illuminated the turn.
Another guard stood near the study door, his posture rigid. She scanned the surroundings. A heavy brass vase sat on a pedestal nearby. She reached out, her fingers tightening around the cold metal,
and nudged it. It wobbled, then tipped. The crash against the hardwood floor was deafening.
The guard spun around, his light cutting through the darkness toward the sound. Clara did not look back.
She lunged forward, staying low, sliding behind a heavy velvet curtain, just as the guard strode toward the fallen vase.
He cursed, his voice low and jagged, and began to inspect the debris.
Clara moved with predatory precision, her feet barely touching the ground. She slipped past the guard,
the fabric of the curtain brushing her face, and vanished into the deeper shadows of the wing.
She was closer now, the study door only 20 paces away, but the house felt alive with eyes.
Julian slammed the heavy iron door of the wall safe, the sound echoing through the study like a gunshot.
Marcus and Silas crowded behind him, their breathing ragged. The steel tumblers clicked back, and the door swung open to reveal nothing but empty shelves. The silence that followed was suffocating.
Julian reached inside, his fingers scraping against the cold, bare metal. He pulled his hand back,
staring at his palms as if they were stained with failure. The shock broke first in Marcus, who lunged forward and shoved Julian aside, tearing at the empty compartments to find a false bottom that did not exist. Silas let out a low, guttural sound and began throwing heavy ledgers from the desk, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. The room descended into chaos.
Papers fluttered through the air like dying birds. The brothers circled the empty safe, their eyes darting across the room, searching for a hidden latch, a loose brick, or a sign of who had beaten them to it.
The initial greed curdled into a sharp, desperate rage. They were no longer looking for the fortune. They were looking for a target for their fury.
Every shadow in the room felt like a witness to their ruin. The brothers were tearing the bookshelves from the walls when the heavy study door clicked open. Elena stood in the frame, motionless, her eyes scanning the wreckage of the room with cool detachment.
She did not raise her voice, yet the brothers stopped instantly, their chests heaving, ledgers dropped to the floor.
Julian stepped forward, his face flushed with adrenaline, demanding to know where the assets had gone.
Elena walked to the desk, her pace measured, and rested a hand on the mahogany surface. She looked at them, not as sons, but as obstacles already cleared from her path. She informed them that the controlling shares were no longer within their reach. They had been transferred to an anonymous holding company hours before their father breathed his last.
The air in the room seemed to thin.
Marcus stumbled back against the wall, his hands trembling as he realized the magnitude of the betrayal.
The brothers looked at each other, their previous rage replaced by a hollow, sickening clarity. They had been fighting over a ghost. Elena watched them struggle with the realization, her expression unyielding. The power had shifted, and they were now entirely at her mercy, left with nothing but the mess they had created.
Miller stood in the shadowed corner of the study, his hand tightening around the handle of his briefcase.
He watched the brothers unravel, their eyes vacant as the reality of their situation set in. He did not wait for their next move. He turned on his heel, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet,
and retreated into the dimly lit hallway. His breathing was shallow, rapid.
He checked the corridor for guards, his eyes darting toward the heavy staircase leading to the rear exit. His composure, once a shield, had shattered into frantic, jagged pieces. He reached the foyer, his pace accelerating until he was nearly running. He did not look back at the brothers or Elena. His focus was entirely on the heavy iron doors at the front of the estate. He shoved his way through the side exit, the night air biting at his face. He moved toward the dark driveway, his briefcase swinging wildly against his leg. Every crunch of gravel under his boots sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. He was abandoning the ship, his movements driven by the raw, animal instinct to escape before the walls closed in completely. The conspiracy was dissolving, and he was the first to run. The iron gates loomed ahead, a final barrier between Miller and the dark road beyond. He fumbled with the latch,
his fingers slipping against the cold metal, his breath hitching in the damp night air.
He pulled the gate open an inch, ready to slip through, when a figure moved from behind the stone pillar. Clara stood directly in his path, her posture perfectly still, blocking the narrow gap.
Miller recoiled, his briefcase hitting the gate with a metallic clang. He tried to brush past her, his face twisted in a desperate sneer. But she stepped into his trajectory, refusing to yield.
She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply held her ground, her presence a wall that forced him to stop.
Miller scanned the darkness behind him, then back at her, his eyes darting like a trapped animal.
The panic had drained from his face, replaced by a cold, sharp realization that his path was cut off. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy, leather-bound ledger. She tapped it against her palm, the sound echoing in the silence of the gatehouse. She had him. There was nowhere left to run, and the weight of the moment settled between them, heavy and absolute. Clara snapped the clasp of the ledger open. The sound was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the distant wind. She held the book steady, tilting the pages so the faint light from the gatehouse lantern fell across the entries. Miller squinted, his initial defiance crumbling into a mask of hollow shock. Rows of precise, machine-generated data filled the paper, documenting every illicit transaction. She pointed to the bottom of the page, where the digital signatures stood in stark, undeniable ink. There was the stylized mark of Julian, the jagged script of Marcus, and the faint, hurried signature of Silas. Beside them, Miller's own unique authorization code was etched in bold, black ink. It was a digital map of their greed, siphoning funds into hidden accounts over 3 years.
Miller reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to grab the ledger, but Clara pulled it back with a sharp,
calculated motion. She flipped to the next page, revealing timestamps that matched the exact moments the company's stocks began their artificial decline. He stared at the evidence, his mouth working silently. The ink was a damning, permanent record that dismantled every lie he had spent months constructing. Every signature was a nail in the coffin of their conspiracy, and as he read them, the weight of the evidence finally forced his knees to buckle. Miller looked up from the ledger, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching for a flaw in the paper that did not exist.
He started to stammer a denial, but the words died in his throat as Clara flipped to the very last entry.
She traced her finger slowly across the final line of data. It was not a brother's mark. It was not Miller's code. It was a signature that looked like a jagged, precise mimicry of a dead man's hand. Clara did not speak, but the silence she held was heavier than any accusation. Miller backed away from the gate, his eyes fixed on the ink, his face draining of all color. He realized then that he was not the mastermind. He was merely a pawn in a game he had failed to understand. A cold breeze swept through the gateway, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming rain. The brothers, having followed the sound of their argument to the gates, emerged from the darkness and stopped dead in their tracks. They saw the ledger. They saw the final signature. The air grew still, charged with a sudden, suffocating tension. Nobody moved. The silence was absolute, a void where the truth of the architect finally began to take shape.
The shock on the brothers' faces shattered into pure, unadulterated rage. Julian lunged forward, his hands balled into tight fists, while Marcus and Silas fanned out to block the path toward the main road.
The ledger was no longer just evidence. It was a death warrant they intended to bury with her.
Clara stepped back, her heels clicking against the stone, until the cold iron of the estate gates pressed firmly against her shoulders.
There was nowhere left to retreat. Marcus kicked a loose stone aside,
his gaze fixed on the book in her hands with predatory intent. They moved in unison,
a wall of aggression closing the remaining 5 yards. Silas reached for a heavy metal rod lying near the gatehouse, his knuckles white. The air grew thick with the sound of their heavy, ragged breathing as they encroached upon her personal space. Julian stepped directly into her field of vision, towering over her,
his shadow swallowing the faint light from the ledger's pages. He did not speak,
but the intent was clear in the way he braced his weight for a final, decisive movement. They were inches away now, a circle of tightening threats, determined to silence the truth before it could reach the authorities.
Julian reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of the ledger, but the movement never finished.
A thin, high-pitched whine pierced the stillness of the night. It started as a faint ripple in the distance, then surged into a rhythmic, mechanical roar that drowned out the brothers' ragged breaths. Every man froze. Julian pulled his hand back as if burned. The sound of tires crushing gravel echoed from the main drive, followed by the blinding glare of high beam lights cutting through the darkness. The brothers pivoted toward the entrance, their faces washed in white, frantic light. Blue and red strobes painted the trees in violent, rhythmic pulses. A heavy vehicle slammed to a halt, blocking the gatehouse entirely. Doors flew open, hitting the metal frames with a series of sharp, metallic cracks. Boots crunched on the gravel, approaching at a rapid, disciplined pace. The brothers stood paralyzed,
the ledger still held in Clara's trembling hands. The predatory circle had dissolved into a scene of chaotic uncertainty.
The law had arrived, and the window for violence had slammed shut. Clara did not wait for the officers to ask. She walked past the brothers, her stride deliberate, and held the ledger out to the lead detective. Behind her, the brothers remained rooted to the spot, their earlier rage replaced by a hollow, flickering confusion. She pointed toward the study desk. The detective followed her gesture, stepping into the room with a flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He hovered the light over the ink stain, then picked up the fountain pen from the dead man's hand. He tilted the pen, tapping it against his palm. It was dry. The ink on the desk was fresh, thick, and still tacky to the touch. Clara spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. Compare them. The chemical composition is wrong. The pen was planted to create a narrative that never happened. The detective bent low, sniffing the desk surface, then looked at the brothers. Julian stared at the stain, his jaw slack, while Marcus looked toward the door, his face pale. The physical evidence of the forgery hung in the air, undeniable and stark. The brothers looked at each other, the realization dawning that they had been manipulated into a trap of someone else's design. The detective straightened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. If the pen is a ruse,
then who had access to the study during the final hour? The silence that followed was suffocating.
Clara didn't look at the brothers. She turned slowly toward the corner where Elena stood, her posture rigid, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. Clara stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing against the walls. Only one person stood to gain from this chaos, Clara said, her voice steady. She reached out and pulled a small vial from her pocket, the glass catching the overhead light. Only one person had the motive to ensure the will was never signed. Elena's hands, which had been pressed against her chest, fell to her sides. The tremor in her fingers vanished. She looked at the lead detective, then back at Clara, her expression shifting from mourning to a cold, razor-sharp indifference. The mask of the grieving widow dissolved, replaced by a terrifying stillness. She did not defend herself. She did not protest. She simply stood, her chin lifted, watching the officers move in to surround her. The brothers gasped, stepping back as if the air itself had turned toxic. The architect of the collapse was finally standing in the light. The lead detective stepped closer to the desk, his gaze fixed on the vial Clara held. "How?" he asked.
His voice barely a whisper in the crowded room. Clara held the glass up, allowing the liquid to catch the light.
"It was not a sudden act," she began, her tone clinical and precise. Miller provided a slow-acting compound. It was tasteless, odorless, and designed to mimic a natural cardiac failure over several hours. She paced the small perimeter of the desk. Elena added it to his evening tea, knowing he would be alone in this study to finalize the will. The toxin worked by constricting the arteries, ensuring he would lose consciousness before he could even call for help. She glanced at the lawyer, who had retreated toward the wall, his face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but the detective silenced him with a sharp gesture. Clara continued. She needed the brothers to be distracted by their own greed, to keep them fighting so no one would notice the time of death. She calculated the dosage to be effective just as the sun set, leaving the body for us to discover in this exact state. The room was deathly still. Every person present looked at Elena, who stood with her gaze fixed on the floor, the cold efficiency of her plan now exposed to the harsh light of truth. Clara walked to the center of the room, her movements deliberate and calm. She tapped the folder in her hand against the desk. "You all fought for a fortune that never existed," she stated, her voice echoing against the mahogany walls. The brothers stared, their expressions frozen in a mix of confusion and mounting dread. Clara opened the folder, revealing the original, authentic will. "I suspected this betrayal weeks ago. I swapped the real document for a forgery long before Arthur passed away." She looked at each brother in turn, seeing their ambitions crumble in real time. "You spent your time spying on each other, siphoning funds, and framing one another, all while chasing a legacy that had already been moved to a holding company you could not touch." She dropped the real document onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, final sound. "Your greed made you blind. You were so desperate to secure your future that you walked directly into the trap I set to expose you." Elena looked at the paper, her composure finally shattering. The brothers slumped, the realization hitting them that their entire scheme was not only discovered, but orchestrated to facilitate their own downfall. Clara stood tall, the undisputed victor in a game they never knew they were losing. The heavy silence was broken by the sharp metallic click of steel cuffs. Two officers stepped forward, moving first toward Miller, who offered no resistance as they pulled his arms behind his back.
Julian and Marcus began to shout, their voices rising in a frantic, disjointed cacophony. But the lead detective ignored them,
signaling his team to clear the room. Silas was the last to be restrained,
his head hanging low as they steered him toward the study entrance. Elena remained motionless near the fireplace, watching the scene with a hollow, distant expression until the officers reached for her.
She did not struggle when the metal tightened around her wrists. She simply turned her gaze away from the desk. One by one, they were led out of the study and into the hallway. The sound of their boots against the hardwood floor faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of the police transport idling outside the main entrance. As the heavy front doors swung shut, the estate returned to a profound, hollow stillness. The dust motes drifted through the shafts of light hitting the desk, settling over the empty chairs where the brothers had sat only moments before. The atmosphere of the house had shifted from a place of suffocating tension to one of cold, absolute finality. The legal paperwork moved through the probate court with ruthless efficiency. Within days, the final rulings were sealed, and the original will was officially ratified. The presiding judge signed the decree, and the clerk's stamp echoed in the quiet courtroom. The document recognized Clara as the sole executor and legal successor to the entire estate. There was no one left to contest the claim. The empire, once fractured by greed and internal sabotage, was now hers to command. She sat in the back of the courtroom as the final gavel strike signaled the end of the long litigation. She gathered the legal folders, the weight of the paper feeling substantial in her hands. She stood and walked out of the hall, the heavy doors swinging open into the bright, harsh light of the day. The estate waited for her, silent and expectant. She reached the threshold of the main house and looked up at the towering structure. It was no longer a cage of secrets or a battlefield for her kin. It was an asset, an organization, and a responsibility. She stepped across the threshold, the floorboards creaking under her steady pace. She moved through the grand foyer, her footsteps ringing out, signaling the beginning of a new order. Clara approached the double oak doors at the end of the hall. She reached out, her palm flat against the wood, and pushed. The doors swung inward with a heavy, rhythmic groan that echoed through the vacant corridor. Inside, the boardroom was vast and dimly lit by the fading afternoon sun. A long mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by empty leather chairs. She walked toward the head of the table, her footsteps measured and deliberate, each sound marking her presence in the space that had once been dominated by others. She reached the main chair and stopped. The room felt immense, stripped of the noise and resentment that had defined it for years. She sat down, pulling the chair forward until it clicked against the table edge. She placed her hands on the polished surface, looking toward the far wall, where the company seal hung. The air was cool and still. She stood up once more, walked back toward the entrance, and grabbed the handles. She pulled them together. The mechanism clicked into place with a definitive, hollow sound. She was alone. The transition was complete. She turned to face the room, the silence serving as the final acknowledgement of her singular control.